Um, leaving that then, one thing that I got to looking at the test of the give, and a third of you will see this question here: how did Confucianism aid the communist takeover in 1949? I didn't realize that was on a test, so two things I think might have helped. That Confucianism might have contributed to the communist takeover. One, stressing obedience. Now, folks, I do believe in obedience to authority until the authority tells you to do something like Hitler did, kill all the Jews. Then I think it's time you disobey. But obedience to authority, yes, is necessary, but stressing obedience, no matter what the authority told you to do. And then by not being a spiritual religion, well, we don't even know if Confucius believed that there is a God. So this might have helped pave the way for a communist takeover. And in that part of the world, we feared, when I was a young man, we feared that the communists would take over all of Asia. They took over China the year I was born. Then a year later, they got part of Korea. Then they got Vietnam, and guess what? From that day to this, they've gotten nothing. They got all of Vietnam in 1975, and then Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, Indonesia. Indonesia got rid of the communists, by the way, by killing 100,000 of them without any help from the United States. They just went on slaughtering and slaughtered all the communists. And that was the end of communism in Indonesia. All right. Anyway, again, sometimes give people help. It hurts them more than it helps them. All right. Japan. First of all, I want to say this about Japan, Korea, and Vietnam, what Chapter 11 is about. All these nations had one thing in common. At one point in their history, they set up civil service exams. They looked on China as being the middle kingdom, in the middle between Tibet, between Mongolia, between Korea, Japan, Vietnam to the south, Japan and Korea to the east, and Mongolia to the north, and Tibet to the west. China was looked on as being the middle kingdom of all this. And China strongly influenced all these countries: Japan, Korea, and Vietnam. Now, China actually conquered Korea for a while and conquered and held Vietnam for a long time. But they could not hold Vietnam indefinitely. And we're going to explain why before the class is out. But China had held Vietnam for quite a long time. So China was strongly influenced in all these countries. By the way, China never conquered Japan. But in the 1930s, Japan went in and conquered a big chunk of China. And had China not gotten help from the United States, it's likely China would today be subjugated to Japan still. But Japan bit off more than they could chew. And they could not take on China, the United States, Great Britain, and eventually Russia. And France too, and Australia. I mean, more than they could handle. All right. Japan. Japan has been compared to Great Britain, and Great Britain is an island offshore from Europe, close to Europe, but nevertheless separated by water from the rest of Europe. And Japan is also separated from Asia by water. This meant that these two countries, Great Britain was greatly influenced by the mainland and yet able to develop its own way in certain areas. And Japan the same way, greatly influenced by mainland China and yet free to develop its own way, much like Great Britain has. They also have another thing in common. Both the Japanese and the British like to drink tea, lots of it. In the case of the British, is to knock off some of the chill because they can't afford to keep their homes warm in the wintertime. So their houses largely stay cold when the weather really gets bad. All right, Japan. Japan consists of 4 big islands. I've written them down here. About a third of you can expect to see their names on your test. Generally, though, this question, most of the students get it right when I ask it on a test. So just be able to recognize it when you see it. Those 4 islands. Japan's geography, their climate is moderate. Now, what I mean by moderate climate, that means they have 4 seasons. They have a spring, a summer, a fall, and a winter. Some places in the world only have a winter and not much else. And some places only have a summer and not much else. But moderate climate means they have the 4 seasons. They have snow in the wintertime, they have cold weather, they have frost. Then they have a planting season and harvesting season. Anyway, their climate is moderate. Now, most of Japan's people live on the East Coast. The East Coast has a very ragged, jagged coastline, which means it has a lot of harbors for ships. The western coastline is more smooth, which means it does not have a good harbor for ships. Also, the East Coast is warmer than the West Coast, owing to the warm waters of the mighty Pacific, the warm winds from the mighty Pacific blowing over the eastern coast. Even though China lies to the west, and there's nothing that lies to the east but about 9,000 to 10,000 miles of ocean. But nevertheless, most of the people live on the east side of the island. Now, Japan was made by volcanoes spewing up ash. The volcanoes started underwater, and they spewed up more and more and more ash until finally the ash reached the surface. Then the volcanoes kept spewing up ash until they created the 4 islands of Japan. Today, those volcanoes are largely inactive. But what this means is that at one time these volcanoes were some of the largest in the world. And it also is, the volcanoes happen because Japan lies on what you might call a fault line. In other words, where 2 tectonic plates come together. That's where the islands of Japan are located. What this means is that Japan occasionally experiences some severe earthquakes. And occasionally they get an earthquake that measures 9 on a Richter scale. And if you haven't heard, 9 on a Richter scale, each number on a Richter scale is 10 times bigger than number 4. So we had a 4 earthquake one time, several years back, and it just shook the place a little bit. 5, now it starts getting doing damage at 5. A 4 earthquake won't do much damage, but we knock a few loose dishes off a shelf or something. A 5, now that can do some damage. A 6, that will be deadly. A 7, very, very bad. 8, extremely bad. And then a 9, unimaginably bad. But back in 2011, Japan had a 9 on the Richter scale earthquake. And yes, it was bad. It was followed by a tsunami that washed a bunch of salt water into their nuclear reactors. Some of you might remember it. But the Japanese are resilient. They can recover pretty fast. They've had earthquakes, several of them during my lifetime, plus some that occurred during the days when my grandfather was alive. Their creation myth says it started from a union of a god and a goddess, and this union created the universe, or created the world, you might say. The thing about this creation myth that's unique, it's usually only found among primitive peoples, and it usually goes away when these peoples meet civilization. But in the case of Japan, I'm not going to name the god and goddess, your book does, but in the case of Japan, their creation myth has survived to this day, which is rare. I mean, except for Japan, it does not exist among people we would call advanced. But they still believe it. Even though I must say, the Japanese are the least interested in their religion of any people on the face of the earth. Their religion matters least to them. And it's generally long been that way, but they do have a religion, which we'll talk about later. Now, the one thing this myth does for them is it puts up their emperor as being a god, which they don't believe any longer. Now, the Japanese believed their emperor was a god up until 1945, when as part of the peace treaty they made with the United States, the emperor agreed to renounce his claim to divinity, which he did, not by going on television, because no emperor went on television until 2011, when a present emperor went on television to console the dead after the earthquake. But anyway, they have since renounced their claim to divinity, but they do still keep time based on the reign of the emperor. Now, if we did that, this year would be year number 2 for President Trump. But then we only keep our presidents no longer than 8 years. So if we went by, let's say, Great Britain, this would be year number 60 for Queen Elizabeth. Or no, this would be the 60th year, I believe it's right, of Queen Elizabeth. Whereas, no, it's actually the 65th. Right, this is, she took office, she became queen in 1953. 65th year of Queen Elizabeth. Again, if we kept time, but the way the Japanese do. All right. The earliest known inhabitants of Japan were the Jomon. And the name Jomon which sounds somewhat like Japan. Then came the Yayoi, Y-A-Y-O-I. At one time we believed that the Yayoi were a separate people, but your book is now saying that it looks like the Yayoi were actually related to the Japanese, and the Yayoi are descended from the original Jomon. Apparently they were once called Jomon, and then they changed their name to Yayoi. And it is believed that when they first came in to Japan, they lived by primitive hunting and fishing and food gathering. But some historians say that they probably had mastered agriculture when they first came in, that wherever they came from, they carried agriculture with them. It is believed that the Japanese came from mainland China, and might be a mixture of the Chinese, the Koreans, and the Mongolians. Again, where they came from is somewhat shrouded in mystery. At first, they lived in individual tribes, and each tribe had a chieftain. And the chieftain claimed that he was descended from the gods, but eventually one of them took over and conquered all the others. And his descendants have ruled Japan as emperor ever since. Now, because the emperor is looked on as being divine, this means that unlike other places in the world, no Japanese emperor has ever been overthrown by someone who was not of royal blood, and this person taking their place. Like in the case of China, they'd have a dynasty that would last, some lasted more and some lasted fewer generations. Then that dynasty would be wiped out and a new dynasty take over. In the case of Japan, their emperors have never been deposed. They still, in fact, that was one of the reasons the Japanese did not want to quit fighting World War II. They wanted the United States to promise that they'd let their emperor remain emperor. And the United States insisted, no, we don't want any misunderstanding. We want you to give an unconditional surrender. But when the Japanese finally gave us unconditional surrender, we allowed the emperor to remain emperor. And he's not alive. He died in 1989, but his son is still alive today. And the Japanese royal family made the news because one of the emperor's women married a common person, just like within the last week. All right. Now, Japan's land is very, very mountainous, very steep mountains, which makes farming difficult until only about 20% of the land can be farmed. It's not because the soil is bad, it's because the land is extremely mountainous. Now, this is the most interesting thing to me. Their volcanic ash has led to them farming really, really good crops in areas where they can farm. This volcanic ash is, of course, known to be rich in minerals, but quite frankly, we don't know exactly why that volcanic ash makes such good farmland. But it reminds me, folk, of something I heard many, many years ago that if I tried to find it now, I'd probably have a hard time finding it. I mean, some of this stuff about space, you hear it and then it becomes super obscure. But I once heard that when we tried to grow plants, earth plants, in moon soil, the earth plants grew better with moon dirt than they do with earth dirt. I'm thinking, well, hey, you know, what could be the reason for that? And I don't think anybody knows, except that ever since the days of Cain, earth dirt has been placed under a curse. But somehow the curse did not affect volcanic ash coming up from the subsurface, and did not affect the moon either. That's just nobody knows for sure. I mean, there's something else that's going on right here in Georgia we don't know for sure. Why can Vidalia onions only be grown in one place in the world and nowhere else? Something in the soil, we guess, but nobody knows. All right. Around 400 CE, rice was introduced. So the Japanese became excellent rice farmers. Now, you may know that during its lifetime, rice has to be started off underwater, and they have to have a layer of water to cover the rice plant until the rice plant eventually comes above the water. Well, the Japanese learned that they could put koi fish. Now, the koi fish is the same species as the goldfish. They could put koi fish in the rice paddy, and when it came harvest time, they could harvest both the koi fish and the rice and eat rice and koi together, something that the other nations around them never did learn to do, even though the Vietnamese grow rice, the Koreans grow rice, and of course the Chinese grow rice, and the Japanese grow rice. But only the Japanese made a habit of growing koi along with the rice. All right. Now, the Japanese political history, and again, I can go into detail, but it's like a pendulum. It goes back and forth between a strong centralized government on the one hand or a local government on the other. And the fact that they're divided into 4 islands means that there have been times, because if there's a weak central government, any one of the 4 islands could sense that the central government is weak and rebel, and the pendulum would swing towards local government. But then when you had local government, you might have your local people fighting each other, and after a while there'd be a demand for a stronger central government and a local government. Now, it reminds me, folk, of something Socrates told us 2,300 years ago, that when the government becomes too weak to enforce its own laws, and people start demanding a stronger government. And I wonder, some of you might be aware that most of you probably aren't. In Brazil, they've elected a new president. I mean, okay, one of you is shaking a couple of, and he has said, I'm going to get tough on criminals. A policeman who shoots a bad man is going to be rewarded and not punished. He said, I'm going to put you all in jail, and the ones I don't kill. He said, if I have to, I'm going to put you all in our boats and anchor the boats several miles offshore to where you can't get out, can't get loose, can't swim back. He said, I'm going to get tough for the criminal element. And a lot of people, the people voted for it, purely and simply. They elected him. Yeah, those 2 or 3 of you looking at me like you've heard this already. Well, congratulations to you. But here's what's happening in Latin America. The gangs are taking over to where even your leaders will ask a gang leader for permission to do certain things. This actually is going on to where the gang members are controlling the politicians. And a lot of people decide, hey, we've had enough of this. and they're demanding a tough central government. And folks, the problem is political correctness, and the solution is to do away with political correctness. If you don't like what I just said, I'm sorry. No, I'm not sorry. No, I'm not. But again, will that happen here? If we let the bad guys take over, there'll sooner or later come a move. I mean, when I was in high school, I had a teacher named Mr. Woods who said that democracy will not work for everybody. There's only a certain kind of people who can make it work, and the people it won't work for are the Far Eastern peoples and Latin American peoples, and we in the United States are fast becoming independent. Democracy works when you have people who self-restrain, restrain themselves without the government holding their hand, the club over them, to restrain them. Anyway, the Japanese went back and forth with their government. Strong central authority, then weak central authority. Oftentimes now the emperors were nothing more than mere figureheads. And today it's the same thing. Your emperor is nothing more than a figurehead. But the people who rule in his name. And for instance, nobody in my morning class knew this, but during World War II, the emperor was, we looked on him as being the actual leader, but the actual leader in Japan during World War II was a man named Tojo. We don't hear about Tojo anymore, but Tojo was the actual power, and the emperor was a really shy, retiring man and a figurehead. But he outlived all the other World War II leaders. He lived until 1989. By that time, all the other World War II leaders were gone. All right. And again, there came a time in Japan when the state owned all the land and all taxes was collected by the central government. Then the central government redistributed taxes to where they thought it was needed. There were no local taxes, and it was all centrally done. Folks, this might have helped lead up to World War II because unquestioned obedience was something that Germany demanded, that Italy demanded, and Japan demanded. And they all fought together, and you might say lost together. All right. Into Japan, Buddhism was introduced, but Buddhism was looked on as being a foreign religion in Japan, in much the same way as it was in China. But the persons who objected to Buddhism got together to form a new religion called Shintoism. Shintoism can get its